All right. Thank you. That concludes our business meeting. And now we get to the good part. We get to welcome our speaker, David Michaelis. David is the award-winning author of 6 books, including the national bestsellers N.C. Wyeth, which won the 1999 Ambassador Book Award for Biography, and Schultz and Peanuts, a National Book Critics Circle Best Recommended Book. He published Eleanor, a 1-volume biography of Eleanor Roosevelt, this past fall. And we're very happy to have him here to talk about that book. And he is a local resident, lives in the town of Bedford. So we're very grateful that he's here with us today. And there we go. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Cindy. Thank you all for having me. It's 2022, kind of shockingly. 2022, it is well past time for me to stop talking about this book because it was published 2 years ago, actually, in the fall, and it had a nice run last year on the New York Times bestseller list as a paperback. But the truth of the matter is, democracy is under threat, and really, no greater moment than right this minute in Ukraine. And it made me realize, actually, with Ukraine, Eleanor Roosevelt once said, "We are all on trial to show what democracy means." And I realized, well, exactly. I'm still on the hook here. I thought I was going to hang up my spikes, but I have to keep explaining what Eleanor Roosevelt meant to democracy and what democracy meant to her. For Eleanor, democracy was, of course, about inclusion. It was about expansion of our institutions, of our government, of what our government can do for you, for what you can do for us and for our government. But it wasn't just for her a balancing act of institutions. It was an ethic. It was a moral ethic. It was about democracy. Was about how we treat each other. It was about how we disagree with each other. It was about doing that with dignity and respect. It reminded me of, I came across the other day in a book of E.B. White's editorials in 1943, July 3rd, he wrote about the meaning of democracy. And he wrote, democracy, this is the author of Charlotte's Web, and Stuart Little, and the New Yorker, the great New Yorker founder writer. Democracy is the feeling of privacy in the voting booths, wrote E.B. White, the feeling of communion in the libraries, the feeling of vitality everywhere. Democracy is a letter to the editor. Democracy is the score at the beginning of the ninth. It is an idea which hasn't been disproved yet, a song the words of which have not gone bad. It goes on, but their letter to the editor part reminded me of why I felt inspired as well to join you all this morning. And it was a letter to the editor in our local paper. To the editor, the Lewisboro Library is the heart and soul of our town. Its support and funding by the town of Lewisboro is crucial to help maintaining this library as an integral part of our lives. A town without a vibrant library is one that lacks spirit and strength and energy. It is the center of life, bringing together many people who would not have otherwise met each other. It brings books and reading and all myriad of subjects to life for children and teens and adults. It is a meeting place. It's a cultural center. We're all members of this undeniably important town institution. Eleanor would have loved this letter. It goes on to discuss some of the disagreements that were going on around the time this was written, and she would have loved this discussion. She would have loved that this discussion can be brought to our attention and into our lives, and from it comes the sense of the importance that what we each have to contribute, and what we're taking from and giving back to. Eleanor's life was all about the individual. Her life as a first lady was about the individual. When I say the individual, I mean each of us. She cared deeply about the individual as a part of democracy, as a part of the whole. I think really when Eleanor came into office, when Franklin came into office, her husband as President of the United States, and Eleanor came into the White House as First Lady, the individual was under siege. I mean, there was the devaluation of the individual in the Great Depression was one of the first problems that she had to deal with. It was a part of her life because she, from the very early day, her own very early days as an orphan, was cast out really from the world that she was raised to become part of. Her father was Theodore Roosevelt's brother. Her mother was Anna Rebecca Hall Roosevelt, from an old family stretching back to the both sides of her family really stretched far back into American history. On her mother's side, back to the Declaration of Independence and its signers. Eleanor, lost her parents very quickly. Over the course of 19 months, when she was 10 years old, she lost her mother to diphtheria, she lost an older brother to diphtheria, and she lost her father, who drank himself to death. By the time she was 10, she was on her own. She was part of a great American family. She was part of an aristocratic world, but she was on her own in a way that I think no other figure who becomes so important really is so isolated in the early days. She was her father's great love. Her father was the one to whom she turned to. She had a kind of relationship with him out of a Dickens novel. She was always sort of shaking her finger at him, reminding him to do things. And it was a kind of beginning for her. In all of Eleanor's life, you see these sort of bookends of what's there at the beginning is there at the end. I mean, here she is admonishing the world. We're on trial to show what democracy means here at the end of her life. In her orphanhood with a younger brother, Hall, she was moved to her grandmother's house, both in the city, in New York City, and then up the river in Tivoli on Hudson. She lived in this, it looks rather dark and forbidding here. It was actually a place that was full of life because she had these kooky aunts, uncles who had been tennis champions, men about town who were now actually dipping into alcoholism. But her kooky aunts and her partying uncles made her become the sort of adult in the house. Eleanor early on became the person who appeared when her Uncle Valley was once again found in the Tenderloin, the district in New York, around 42nd Street, what would now be around 42nd and below. She would go and talk to the Irish desk sergeant. She knew how to speak to that guy. These aristocrats, these uncles and aunts, this grandmother Hall knew nothing about how to speak to an Irish desk sergeant. Eleanor was sent at 15 abroad, and she had a great stroke of luck because she lucked into a great mentor. I mean, I think we all have this experience in our lives where if you have a great mentor who comes along at a certain time, this was Maurice Ruvest. She caught Eleanor at just the moment where Eleanor was being told essentially by her grandmother and her aunts in the world they lived in, the world that you now see on the HBO Plus show, The Gilded Age, that women had no place in the world, outside of the house, outside of the domestic sphere, outside of maybe a committee or a charity or two. Eleanor was told by Madame Ruvest, you have a mind, you have you have thoughts. Give me your original thinking. Give me what you think about the Boer War. Give me what you think about the situation in Europe today. She learned also at this school, which was a school for young women from privileged families, mostly in Europe, that she could be an intermediary. She could go between. She brought the concerns of her classmates to the headmistress. She was the one who interpreted the headmistress back to them. She had a special role in the school, following the example of her aunt, that is to say, Theodore Roosevelt's sister, who had been a favored pupil of the same Madame Ruvest. Eleanor became the favorite pupil. She became the popular girl among the other women. It was the place where she finally, in her own life, sort of came into herself for the first time and made her realize that she could contribute. She could give something back. Back she went to the United States to become a debutante. A horrific role for her in particular, because her father's death from alcoholism and his addiction to laudanum had been a very public scandal. It had been in the newspapers. And Eleanor's mother's death had occurred just as her mother had been about to take a leading role in society between the old world of New York and the new Vanderbilt, Morgan, Fisk millionaires who were building those big mansions on Fifth Avenue. Eleanor would go into the rooms and the ballrooms and so forth of her coming out and be whispered about behind the hands of the matrons and the generation, her parents' generation, saying, look at Elliot Roosevelt's daughter. Oh, the poor thing. She suffered a kind of outsiderness that she found actually in her fifth cousin, Franklin, who She met on a train one day. They had been thrown together in the nursery at the age of 4. Franklin had ridden her off to Boston on his back, in that trot to Boston nursery run. She had been taken with him at a dance, at a family party, because he asked her about books and what she was thinking. And when they met on the train, he was a college sophomore, and she was 19 and coming out as a debutante. And they both discovered that they were outsiders, that they were in their own worlds, uniquely outside the world of their peers, of expected things. They both thought differently, they looked differently at things, and together they made a kind of matching pair. They were already interested in each other as Roosevelts, and in what they thought, what each other thought about being a Roosevelt, about being the heirs to Theodore Roosevelt. It's really important to look upon, when you look at this picture, to see what Franklin saw when people always say about Franklin, why did he marry her? He's the good-looking one. She's a horse-faced, awkward girl, not the kind of Gibson girl you'd expect Franklin Roosevelt to fall in love with. Well, he actually had fallen in love with sort of a Gibson girl type at Harvard, and alienated her by saying he wanted 6 children, and she said, well, I'm not a cow. And Franklin's ideas about his life were all based on Theodore Roosevelt. He had, like so many men his age, a complete worshipful idolization of this great figure who was combining. Theodore Roosevelt uniquely combined Eastern United States, Western United States. The family of Bullocks, his mother's family, were from the South. He combined South and North after the Civil War. He was a figure unusual in the world, unique in the world, and Franklin loved him, and Eleanor loved him, and they both were smitten by the idea of being his niece in her case, 5th cousin in his case, but he looked upon her as the niece of the President of the United States, and that's what he saw. And she was the one who took him into the White House, and she was the one who, when they actually went to the White House for Theodore Roosevelt's inaugural, she was the one who was in the papers as Eleanor Roosevelt, the niece of the president. He was, Franklin B. Roosevelt, some upriver cousin who showed up at, in Washington on her arm very much. When they married, it was very clear right away that they were going to have a very difficult time. He broke out in hives on their honeymoon, a fact I mention only because, not that they didn't have wonderful moments of celebration and high, lovely times in Paris and as they moved through the Alps and into Italy. But his hives were, hives are, you get hives when you can't say things, when you're repressing something, when you're repressing emotions. It appears on your skin. These welts appeared on his skin. What he was repressing, or we assume from his letters and from his whole personality at the time, which was sort of extremely extroverted, extremely externalized, whereas Eleanor was, internalized and very unable to say things herself. She was he felt marked for greatness. She just simply felt marked. She felt marked by having these parents who had vanished and was an outsider even in her own, in their own tribe of Roosevelts. He had, I think, a sense that he would be president. She wanted to be that. She understood that dream and wanted to be the great supporter of it. When he lost an election at Harvard, she was the first one to, and then there was another election for a lesser job in the class of 1904. She said, send me your speech. I want to see what you're going to say in this one so you don't lose this one. She was right on his team right away. But as a couple, as a pair of intimates, they just didn't know how to do this, how to relate to each other, how to bring to the marriage all the expectations and intimacy and love. And Eleanor's, that you hear a lot about in biographies of Franklin Roosevelt, that Franklin was a great, sort of lover of life and a charmer of women and all that, and Eleanor was sort of repressed and uptight. I actually think Eleanor was a highly sexualized person. She was a highly sensual person. When you read her writing at this age, she's completely in tune with nature and with wanting things, longing. She loved, her great the loss of connection to her father meant she was really looking for connection. She couldn't find it in this relationship right away. He couldn't either. They began having children. That was itself a enormous sense of expectation fulfilled. On the one hand, he wanted 6 children. They had 6 children. She lost her third child, The first, Franklin Roosevelt Jr. in 1909, died after a few months of an infection. It was a loss that profoundly affected her. It affected Franklin, of course, but he moved right on. He moved right on into his political career. Eleanor was constantly at a loss in her own home, partly because of the dominance of Franklin's mother, who you see here on the right. I mean, when she gave birth to Anna, who she's holding there, her first child, her daughter, who she's holding there in the middle, she had not her mother. Of course, her mother wasn't there to hold her hand at delivery. Neither men didn't appear at delivery rooms. She delivered at home. Franklin and his mother were downstairs during the delivery of that child. This woman up here, Blanche Spring, a young woman from Maine, was the one who held Eleanor's hand through 5 deliveries, who was the person who taught Eleanor how to be a mom, how to change a diaper, how to hold on to a baby and know that you could feel confident in it, in loving it properly and being loved. In the simple transaction of motherhood, Eleanor was constantly thwarted. She would arrive, you all know from your own lives, I'm sure, from the cries of a infant, you run to the crib. You think they're dying. You think they're suffocating. You'll do anything to make sure that the feedings and the changings and everything are going right. Eleanor would arrive, and there would already be a nanny there that her mother-in-law had hired, who had already been given directions to castor oil the child. And Eleanor was always the last to make decisions about her own children, to make decisions about her own house. She was very isolated in this world that Franklin was the master of. He became in 1913 the Assistant Secretary of the Navy, having been state senator. They'd done time in Albany by now. And down they went to Washington, where Franklin was right in the middle of the beginnings of the Wilson administration. It's a very progressive administration, and all the changes going on in Washington. Eleanor was not yet even ready to take a stand on women's suffrage. She was consumed by becoming the wife of a politician. She had all her card. There was a sort of massive scale ritual of leaving cards, of having wives of other political figures over, hosting, giving dinner parties, all of that. She was completely caught up in that and was certain that men had a better idea of how to deal with issues such as whether women should have the vote than she herself or women. It's not what we think of Eleanor, but what changed her and what the big change, there were three big changes in Eleanor's life. The first was in 1918 when she learned of her husband's affair with her own social secretary, Lucy Mercer. Eleanor offered Franklin a divorce. He thought divorce would ruin his career. His mother thought so even more. Delanos did not get divorced. And Eleanor's first realization that she would not be able to give her husband what he wanted, but that they could continue as partners, was suggested by the way they resolved this crisis when she discovered his letters and Lucy's letters to Franklin and Franklin's to Lucy after Franklin returned in 1918 at the beginnings of the worldwide pandemic called the Spanish flu. And it was coming off of a troop ship, and she found the letters in his luggage. She unpacked it. Weirdly, the pandemic of 1918-19 offered her immediately a role to play, which was to say that as they struggled on in their marriage, and the flu literally leveled the playing field. She suddenly was the one in the house who Franklin was in bed, the children were in bed, people up and down the block were in bed. Washington was hard hit because of the numbers of troops who were in camps around the city. Eleanor went everywhere, bringing baskets and all the rest of it. She became Eleanor Roosevelt in a sort of Florence Nightingale way during that pandemic. But it was really the war that changed her most. It gave her, as we entered Europe's war, she took on jobs at the Red Cross, particularly at a canteen at Union Station in Washington, where she learned how to run a canteen. Mostly also, she saw literally hundreds of thousands of young men parade by every day in trains. I don't mean parade by, I mean, because you see them in parades when she saw them in parades when they came back, but she saw these men and she knew that they were going someplace that they were terrified of. They'd never been abroad. They'd never even seen the sea. They were sending letters back. She would bring the letters in off the trains. She played this role of seeing an entire generation go off to war, and she understood fear and she understood empathy for the first time in ways that she would have never had another chance. When they returned from the war, she was the first, because she was the Assistant Secretary of the Navy's wife, she was the one who would go to Arlington Cemetery. There was a big backup of military. Every returning fallen soldier was given full honors at Arlington. Sometimes because there was such a backup, the family couldn't be there, or the family had come, the burial hadn't happened, they'd had to go back to Kansas. Eleanor was the one who would stand there in the rain, in the cold, in the sun, watching this young man in a box be committed to Earth, and she would be the one who would honor in her own, literally in her own heart. She felt very strongly that each of these men needed somebody to witness what he had done, and she felt the same about the men who were being brought back and with this new illness, shell shock, brought into St. Elizabeth's, burritoed in those blankets, as you see there, for fear that they would lose their mind, that they, having lost their minds, they would also lose control of their bodies. She had a great fear of psychosis, of craziness, because of her own father's behavior and the treatments that he'd received at sanitaria when she was a child, and had to sort of wait for him outside of these rooms in these sanitaria. She conquered her own fears at this point in her life. In her 1919, she was 35 years old, and she was beginning to take real control. When Franklin ran for vice president in 1920, you see there on the right here, on one of their railroad journeys, whistle stop campaigns, Eleanor really began to take control of her own public persona. She helped Franklin run for vice president. She began to learn, she was consulted by his associate Louis Howe for the first time. She had a lot to say, because women, as women were given, white women were given the right to vote in 1920 with the ratification of the 19th Amendment. Eleanor had an entire new job, really, both as a politician's wife, but also, this is sort of I throw these up just to show the kind of decision or choice that you had in 1920, or Eleanor had in 1920. On the one hand, she had the choice to stay in her mother-in-law's sphere and join the Bryson Day Nursery, which is what her mother-in-law thought she should do. And what was that? That was getting on the board of the Bryson Day Nursery and running the rummage sale, with Mrs. Cabot and Mrs. Lodge and Mrs. So-and-so and Mrs. So-and-so. That was the choice on the left. On the right is, the Women's Suffrage Association had become the League of Women Voters, with women suddenly in the political life of the nation. The League of Women Voters needed someone to run the legislative committee, follow legislation as it went through Congress, and Narcissa Vanderlip, the woman on the right, knew Eleanor was beginning to get involved with, had been involved with her husband's campaign, offered her the job, and Eleanor took it. With great fear and reservation, because she felt she had nothing to add. She lucked into these two women. One of the great gifts of Eleanor Roosevelt's political and public life was that she found women along the way, just as she'd found Blanche Spring when she was giving birth to her children. This was Elizabeth Reed on the right, a practicing attorney, a legal scholar, who was the legal consultant on the committee that Eleanor headed up for the League of Women Voters, who taught Eleanor how to do a professional job, how to be a professional, how professionalism itself was something to be aspired to. Elizabeth Reed's partner was Esther Lape, who was also on the League of Women Voters, early founder. She was a teacher at Barnard. They lived together in Greenwich Village. They had Eleanor down to their apartment for champagne. I mean, unheard of at the time. That she would visit a lesbian couple in the heart of American Bohemia, drink champagne and talk about French poetry and politics. They saw in Eleanor her ability to turn ideas into action. That she wanted action. She wanted to do things. She was a Roosevelt, by God. This was the sort of Theodore Roosevelt part of Eleanor's life that kept consistently returning. The other big change, and the thing that consistently remained and that which the change which remained consistent for the rest of her life was the change of Franklin and Eleanor's relationship when polio struck him in the summer of 1921. You all probably know the story of Franklin Roosevelt's paralysis on Campobello Island. It was so extreme, he thought he himself had not just been forsaken by God, but that he would die, that he was being challenged in ways that nobody he knew ever had been challenged, to retain his sanity, to retain his sense of self. He didn't just retain his sense of self or sanity, he retained an extraordinary ability to persuade others that what had happened to him hadn't happened to him, that he was still completely viable as a candidate for president of the United States. Unheard of. You can see here, this is not a candidate for president. This is a man who's suffering an illness that although the worst of it is past, he now has to figure out how to walk again and persuade others. That's Franklin on the left as a vice presidential candidate. That's what a candidate looked like. Not this scarecrow stick figure with pipe cleaner legs, as he called them. Eleanor's choice really was, do I enlist as the one who's going to save him and help him walk again? And she realized she couldn't. And they realized that she shouldn't. And that what she did was she went and became obviously his eyes and ears and legs, but she joined forces with women in politics that she was beginning to know very well, particularly Nancy Cook and Marion Dickerman, who were both involved in women's politics in New York State. There was two sides to this. One was the public side where, I mean, Eleanor even learned how to use the automobile as a way of going around, in how it attracted attention when they would drive into a small town. They went town to town to town across the counties of New York, organizing women in ways that now seem very rudimentary to us, but most women who were given to thinking they would go into a polling place, which was unusual because that was such a male place and scary, somewhat risky it seemed, would just simply vote how their husbands told them. Eleanor's job with Nancy and Marion was to go around and let women know they had a way of thinking about this themselves, that they had issues that were going to be important to them in particular, and that they could have a point of view, and that they could register it by their vote. And that the voting itself was an act of courage, of bravery, and of individuality, but as well of joining a community. Eleanor's life at this point becomes about communities. This is, in part, she made a community with Eleanor and Nancy Cook, with Franklin's help, in a place called Valkill, which was a small cottage that Franklin helped them build on land he owned a mile away from his mother's. It was the way Eleanor first left her marriage, by living apart from Franklin with two women who were a lesbian couple. And she was a third sort of, what Eleanor had missed was that she had never been allowed to be angry. She'd never been allowed to show her emotions. She'd never been allowed to be pissed off at somebody. If she were resentful or angry, she was told to go into a bathroom and weep into the tub. She was told to do all this by herself. These two women taught her how to be an adult. They would literally ride her and treat her in a way where they would say, you can't just walk out of the room and freeze up for the next week. You have to tell us why you're mad. You have to say the words. And it was a sort of Goodwill Hunting kind of relationship where it was therapeutic. She was literally learning how to have a feeling, how you could be angry and the person wasn't going to suddenly vanish on you. All the things that we might learn today, somewhere between 16 and 25, Eleanor was learning in her 30s from these two women, as she was learning from them also how to become a active woman in politics. With Esther Lape there on the left, doing work in Washington for the Bach Peace Prize, and as a woman in New York State politics in the women's division, Eleanor became an enormously successful and powerful woman. Again, action, turning ideas into quickly, not sitting around with committees, doing things, movement. She went everywhere. And as Franklin was in his final years, it seemed his final years of rehabilitation, it was really Eleanor who, in her relationship with Al Smith, the governor of New York, and Al Smith's campaigns for governor and Al Smith's campaigns for president of the United States, where Eleanor had developed an enormous network as a politician, as the leader of the Women's Democratic the women's division of Democratic politics in New York State as her base of operations. She was the one who brought Franklin into politics, back into politics. She urged him to make his comeback speech in 1924, where he hobbled up to the, appearing to walk. He got himself to the podium to nominate Al Smith for president in 1924 at the Democratic National Convention. She was the one who said, you've got to do it again in 28. And in 1928, it was only because Eleanor got Franklin literally on the phone at Warm Springs that Al Smith persuaded him to run for governor of New York, while Al Smith turned to the presidency one final time. Franklin won, Al Smith lost. Eleanor was a first lady of New York State and was one of the greats, by now interested in all kinds of in labor, in very deep into the labor movement, deep into social progress for women across the board in labor, in politics, and beginning to understand that her role, letting other women know that her role as mother, as wife could go on. She was the head of a furniture factory that she'd started with Nancy Cook, and she was the teacher at a school for girls with Marion Dickerman in New York City. She taught English and history. And as all of this was shaping up, she was a person like no other. She could, for the first time, write a book saying what's going on in the world with the Depression, with the social ills that the world is facing. This is something women can uniquely equipped to deal with. Even simply writing a book, as Mrs. Franklin D. Roosevelt, was an extraordinary act at the time. The beginning of many, many books, and the beginning of her life as a writer, a communicator. Eleanor did not want Franklin to run for president. She knew that if she became the first lady of the United States, the hostess and mistress of the White House, she would lose a lot of the individuality that had come to her by her hard-won efforts. She had fallen in love with Lorena Hickok. She had a fully eroticized, fully sensual, a fully realized love relationship with an AP reporter as she came into the White House. Franklin came into the White House on his mother's arm. Eleanor came into the White House and immediately was locked herself into a bathroom with Lorena Hickok on the second floor to do an interview. This was unheard of. All the things the Roosevelts did when they first were dealing with the Depression and dealing as a couple with the nation's problems were coming out of now 20 years of them having separated into two different communities, side-by-side communities. They were actually ideally suited to be not just president and first lady in a White House that was committed to social justice, social progress, but mostly committed to the individual and committed to how the United States was going to find its way back to a pluralist democracy that was going to include more and more people and include people in a way that required that they take part in their government. One of Eleanor's greatest gifts, and I'm not going to, I think, have time to go on really much longer. I think I've hit some of the highlights here. But one of the things she was able to do is to connect with people. She had that ability. Nelson Mandela talked about it. It was the profound sense that we're human only through the humanity of others. She found herself and she found her role as First Lady, which was, by the way, a role that, I mean, she freed the job of First Lady for all other First Ladies. Before that, First Lady's requirements were basically to have a sour smile, roll some eggs on the White House lawn, and stay put and shut up. Eleanor went everywhere, and she talked to everyone, and she included you in her understanding that government was there for you, but that you were there also to help your government. And it was when she connected with people, she gave them in the sense that they had something to give back. It wasn't just a one-way thing. Here are the bonus marchers. This is the second bonus in this image. This is the second group of bonus marchers who came to Washington. Hoover brought the army out after the first ones, told MacArthur to go and blow up their camps in the Anacostia River. MacArthur overran their camps. He destroyed the march. The second bonus marchers came They still hadn't gotten what the government had promised them for their service in World War I. They were encamped on the Anacostia again. Louis Howe brought Eleanor out there. She didn't know how to talk to these men. He said, go into the tent and just start talking to them. Well, within minutes, she had discovered that the songs that she remembered from the canteen in Union Station were the same songs that they knew and that they wanted to sing. They were talking about events of the war, of the First World War. She was utterly smitten by them and they by her. And it was a typical moment where the next day in the paper, it said one of the bonus marchers was quoted saying, Hoover brought the army, Roosevelt brought his wife. She was a unique, utterly unique presence. She was her own person, but she was Franklin's, the extension of the president. When the president, you went to the president. If you were lucky enough to go to the White House, you went to the president. Eleanor went to you. And it was this new idea, really, that the government of the United States, that the United States itself was there for you. She was always there for people in a way to the end of her life. I mean, she expanded this idea of the individual and of community into its greatest dimensions nationally, but then after Franklin's death, internationally, through the Declaration of Human Rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the greatest triumph of Eleanor's career, remade our understanding of what human beings deserve, what human beings are, what human beings have the right to. World War I had destroyed that, and it seemed as if we would be forever at the mercy of autocratic and authoritarian regimes. That document, it doesn't have the mechanism of a covenant, it doesn't have the mechanism of a police force or a military force behind it, but it has a moral force, and it's been the center of American foreign policy for 5 decades. Eleanor was the only one who could do it, bring together the new nations of the United Nations to decide what it is that a human being should be and what a human being deserved. Eleanor's responsibility to us, to each of us as individuals, and her responsibility to her husband and to his legacy eclipsed everything in the last part of her life, even herself. I mean, I think one of the tragedies of Eleanor was that she never really found the connection and love she was looking for. My book discusses toward the end a relationship she had with the doctor, her doctor in the end of her life, which is somewhat tragic and sad, somewhat fascinating. I always felt at the very end that Eleanor had done what some people do, I guess, when they connect with other people on a grand scale. She let her love for the country and for others be the love that she could allow back to herself in small bits. She was ever isolated, surrounded by her family at the end. She died of a tuberculosis infection at the relatively young age of 78 in 1962, just as the Cuban Missile Crisis once more challenged the idea that we could live peacefully on the planet. There's no question that our democracy is the greater for her, for the nobility of spirit that she brought out the way Lincoln did, saying, the better angels of our nature were going to be present when Lincoln was president. With Eleanor, she asked us for imagination. She asked us for our forgiveness and our reciprocity and our spirit of dignity, our ability to treat each other better and better. I miss her every day, and I'm really grateful for the opportunity to have rambled this way and to talk to you about her, because it's a little like when a tree gets taken down somewhere that you're very familiar with, the sky suddenly becomes very empty overhead. I don't really have yet a new project because the sky over my head here in Bedford, where I've been working on Eleanor for 10 years, is still ever wide. And thank you for the chance to talk today. I really appreciate it.
Thank you very much, David. I'm going to stop the screen sharing, and then, oh, David, I think you have to stop sharing.
Yeah, sorry.
That's okay. More grid pictures.
Yeah.
And then we can after the, let's see.
Yeah, there we go.
Huh. All right, and now I
Okay.
can also change it to the gallery view. And if anybody has any questions for David, if you want to unmute. Mary, looks like do you have a question?
I was just going to ask if David could give us a word or two or maybe five on the work that Mrs. Roosevelt did on civil rights and how she was a better proponent for civil rights than her husband.
Yeah, I think, Eleanor was always ahead of Franklin on racial equality. She was a surprisingly, sometimes shockingly to me, slow walker of issues. She was with J. Philip Randolph coming to Washington, threatening a march of 400,000 sleeping car porters. It was Eleanor who would say to him, "You can't do that right now. You've got to wait. You've got to speak to the president first. You've got to do it within the protocols, within the right." She was a great believer in doing things within the institutions so that they would count, so that they would stick. At the same time, she took action boldly, much more boldly than Franklin Roosevelt, who, as you know, was hamstrung throughout most of his presidency by a southern wing of the Democratic Party. He couldn't get the New Deal. I mean, very simplistically, much of the New Deal legislation could not go through without the Democrats in the South voting with him, and to vote on an anti-lynching bill would have alienated the entire South. That's the simplistic way of looking at it. I think Franklin could have and should have shown a great deal more courage on those matters. Eleanor showed courage very distinctly in, let's say, for example, in 1938, she went down to Birmingham, Alabama, where the Southern Conference was having its meeting. And it was clear that she immediately sat down in the hall in Birmingham with a Black associate that she was working with, who right away it was said she was breaking the law by not sitting in the whites only section. They had divided the hall into Black and white. She told someone to go get a ruler, and she measured the distance between the chairs of the Black section and the white section. And then she took her chair and put it right in the middle and sat down. Bull Connor this was the early phase of Bull Connor in 1938, not the 1962 later Bull Connor or 64 Bull Connor that we know. Was too afraid to arrest her, it was said. She became ever bolder. She resigned her membership in the Daughters of the American Revolution in protest so that Marian Anderson would be given a hearing, as she was given then a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Eleanor happened to have been in Hyde Park that day, not there. It was Easter Sunday. She had to be with the president. There's always a moment in Eleanor Roosevelt's career with civil rights where you find that she's very human in her responses. She's trying to learn what it means to be a white person in a world in which Black people are now being taken seriously. She doesn't, she's learning. She was learning how to relate. What is a Black person? What is a Black person? What does it mean when a Black person is now in charge of a college? What does it mean when an African American is a leader? I mean, these were all new. She was willing, by the time that she was First Lady, she was more than willing to go out front as often as she could. And as time went on, especially after, we have only to remember that it was Harry Truman, Franklin Roosevelt's successor, who integrated the armed forces. Franklin Roosevelt did not. Eleanor was incredibly, was at the forefront of bringing African-American nurses into the armed forces in World War II. That was an initiative of hers. And you see, I think, Eleanor's great struggle as First Lady, as Franklin Roosevelt's wife, particularly in 1941, with the incredibly unfortunate and real mistake that Roosevelt made in interning Japanese Americans in concentration camps in response to hysteria, really, mob hysteria that broke out after Pearl Harbor, where Japanese Americans were thought to all be essentially fifth colonists or part of a force that was going to take the United States down from the inside out. Franklin Roosevelt's Attorney General, Francis Biddle, strongly told him that if he took this unconstitutional step of creating an executive order, stripping Japanese Americans of their rights, of their property, of their freedom, that future presidents would be able to do the same. Biddle's prophecy came true with the former president, with 45. And and Eleanor knew it. She went right out to the West Coast and did as much as she could in a sort of public relations way. She wasn't able in that case, except she could go to the camps and she could go and listen and she could go and bring her voice and she could bring her ear especially. And she was a constant listener. And I think for a lot of people, knowing that Eleanor was listening, that she could bring issues back to Washington, into the mix, into the White House, was an incredibly important thing at the time.
Andrew, you have a question?
When I first met David out on Martha's Vineyard through some mutual friends in about 1986, little did I know that we would be neighbors right down the road here. And I was so impressed. Back then at our initial meeting, I got one of his early books, Best of Friends. It was a wonderful treatment on friendships. This was just amazing. So thank you, David. I want to encourage everyone. He's written many, many wonderful books, including the Charles Schulz book, N.C. Wyeth. So I want to encourage everybody to borrow his books at your local library or purchase them at your local bookstore. And I think today is a shining example of what library services are all about. Enlightenment, knowledge, and inspiration, so we can all sort of find our sense of place in our community and the world. So I just don't really have a question because we could talk about Eleanor and your other books all day long, but I just wanted to say thank you. And it's good to see you again. Thanks.
Thank you. Well, listen, you know, there's a pretty lengthy acknowledgments in Eleanor, and one of the paragraphs or so that I committed in acknowledgments, my acknowledgments, was to the Westchester Library System, and it's simply because you would think that it was sort of creaky, or you might think that you weren't in a place. This library system, I'd say, works as well or better than a number of university library systems I know of. And I also discovered kind of an amazing thing, which was that, and I'm not quite sure why, I never got the answer, but Mount Vernon never deaccessioned its collections at the time where other libraries did, which was around the 60s or 70s. So that whenever I needed Roosevelt era books, and I would sometimes discover at Mount Vernon books that you literally weren't even available on eBay. There they, not just there, but they'd come to Bedford Free or Katona the next day. I mean, I'd have in my hands a book that I needed the very next day. And this is incredible for, you know, a scholar or writer, or someone who's looking, and so it's a pretty unique part of the library system, I think, that it can serve a working writer as well as a school kid in the same, you know, under the same roof, and with the same wonderful staff and with incredible cheeriness. And people would always be interested in, as the books came from Mount Vernon, like, wow, look at this, you know, these were old books.
They do have an incredible collection as our central library. It is amazing what you can get from there.
I went down several times. It's a wonderful library, actually, in Mount Vernon.
David, what led you to write about Eleanor?
Personal things there were two main personal ones. One was that my mother worked with Eleanor Roosevelt when I was a small child. She was a producer on Eleanor Roosevelt's last television program, which was called Prospects of Mankind, where every month Eleanor would have a guest on, like young Henry Kissinger or young JFK, and they would discuss in what today sounds more like a Brookings Institution seminar than a television program. It was even before the French Chef and Julia Child came to WGBH. This was all in Boston. So I had a childhood, early, deep childhood sense that, I heard David Geffen once say this on a documentary, I kind of thought we were related to her. You know, I thought she was a grandmother, a great grandmother or something. I thought somehow she was part of my family, which was actually emotionally correct. That is exactly right. I mean, that's how people felt about Eleanor Roosevelt. So I had a strong feeling about that. And then I had an equally strong feeling that I had written access biography. I mean, my books on Wyeth and Schultz are wonderful books because they were both first. They were both the first biography of N.C. Wyeth and the first biography of Charles. And the first biography is usually done where somebody writes to a widow or a family and says, "I'd like to write about, you know, N.C. Wyeth," and somebody writes back and says no, and then you begin a long process, or someone writes back and says yes, it'd be wonderful if you wrote. So, but instantly you're involved in a whole transactional world that is can be very fair and actually can work out very nicely, or it can work out very complicatedly. But I wanted to have, but my point being, no matter how it ends up, the writer's relationship to the subject affected by those relationships to a widow, to children, to the family, to the people who knew the person, for good and for ill. I wanted a relationship with the subject. Again, it's about libraries. I wanted to go into the FDR library, which is a presidential library, which is a part of the National Archives, just like you, like anybody, and just say, I'm here to write a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. Where are the papers? Well, there's 1 million documents there, and that's just the beginning. But in other words, I really wanted to just see if I could write about somebody without access, without having a sense of special relationship born of this, because I think with Eleanor, it's actually a mistake. I think she's one of the great democratic figures, and we all should be able to go and write a biography of Eleanor Roosevelt. So that was sort of the mission. The other mission was, I felt that she had been treated like homework, you know, like sort of, she was this sort of kind of dowdy version of her, sort of, you know, there was sort of something, I just knew she was sexier and more wonderful than this sort of dowdy homework version, and that I really wanted to know her. And I didn't like that she was treated as a labeled lesbian. I mean, if you do that Google thing where you write, does George Washington have, the next most asked question right this minute in America is wooden teeth. If in 2009, if I said, is Eleanor Roosevelt, the next word would be gay. All anyone wanted to know about Eleanor when I started was, is she gay? She was sort of like the gay Thomas Jefferson. There was like, we were sort of re-looking at her through this one little lens. It was wrong. She wasn't gay. She was bisexual. She had issues about love that had been unresolved. She was definitely in love with a woman that we know of. There were probably others, but she certainly had a relationship that there's actual evidence of, and people had interpreted that evidence of, i.e. the letters between Eleanor and Lorena Hickok, to mean different things. That's fine. You know, I'm not going to shake it, but to suddenly turn Eleanor Roosevelt into, you know, the avatar of gay politics was not Eleanor Roosevelt. And I thought, at least I'll do a restoration, not against or contra. I'm all for gay politics. That's not the issue. The issue is her to see her clean, to see her clear, to see her for herself was what I thought my mission should be. And that if there was going to be another, and also, by the way, no one had written a 1-volume biography for a long time, which sounds like a sort of publishing thing, but actually it's a real challenge. I mean, to me, it's still a miracle that all of her fits into this one book.
Yeah, and 1 volume is so much more accessible to most readers as well.
Well, yeah, I mean, my predecessor, Blanche Wiesen Cook, who was one of the people who brought Eleanor into the world as a passionate, loving person. I will not take anything away from Blanche's Eleanor, but because of the way those books, there were 3 of them ultimately, but the way the first 2 were reviewed, you know, the reviewers sort of made it into a whole issue about whether she was gay or not, which is so limiting. I mean, it's just not, you know, there's just so much more to anybody, but certainly to Eleanor Roosevelt than who she loved and how that worked out.
Mm-hmm. I see that Danielle Greenberg has a question.
Well, actually, it's not so much a question. I wanted to share an anecdote. I got to meet Eleanor Roosevelt when I was in junior high school because I was part of the New York City junior high school choir, and it was mostly the students, the choir members, were mostly members of color. And even at the end of her life, it was either the year she died or the year before she died, she came to our performance and she made a point of shaking each one of our hands. And none of us really knew exactly who she was, but we knew that she was a big deal. And so we were very, very excited. And I've always been just thrilled that I had that opportunity, even though it's not much, but it was something.
It's amazing how there's always somebody who met her. And I'm so glad it's you.
Well, I didn't exactly,
Well, you did.
But I did get to shake her hand. But it was just so wonderful that even when she was quite old, she was reaching out to try to bring people along.
Wonderful. Jay, did you have a question or a comment?
Let me unmute. Good. Yeah, hi. I just want to make a comment. My grandfather lived in Brooklyn, lived through the Depression, and kind of a man's man, but he would always tell us, yeah, the fireside chats and FDR was president, but Eleanor really ran the country. That's what he always used to say when we were kids. He always used to say that to us. How true do you think that was or wasn't? I mean, coming from him, it was such a surprise comment.
Well, it's a comment that could cut both ways, and I respect what he's saying, because in a way, what he's saying was, at night, Franklin would shake the martinis, Eleanor wouldn't drink, and there would be a basket both at the sort of next to the place where the martinis were shaken in the oval room upstairs. It's sort of a sitting room area that they had upstairs, and then by Franklin's bed, there'd be another basket, and she would put that stuff in there and say, Franklin, as soon as you stop shaking the martini, you got to look at this. You got to look at this. You got to look at it. And there's a moment where Frederick Douglass, it says, agitate, 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 and it's the last thing that Frederick Douglass says. It's not like I've learned 3 words, that I'm going to leave you with in my life. He says, it's not love, faith, or charity. It's agitate, agitate, agitate. Eleanor's the same way. She was sort of agitate, agitate, agitate with Franklin. She wouldn't let him rest. She knew how much power. I mean, he was the soldier of freedom. And the thing that's so hard to do these days is to remember how big he was and how big she was too. But how big he was, because all the TV and everything brings him down into this sort of small little area. And I think that when she said something to him, he listened. And it's really clear that he was able to, she gave him cover sometimes on things, but other times she just hung him right out there and said, you got to do this. And I think that's she was the most psychologically pervasive member of the Roosevelt administration, both in him, but also in people, and that she got herself out there and people felt that, if you think about what it would be like right this minute trying to get the CEOs of Verizon on the phone to talk about your bill, like you got something on your bill, right? You want to get that, some little thing taken over. You would no more be able to get the CEO of Verizon on the phone than you would to get a human being on the phone to talk about your bill. What Franklin did, and Eleanor with him, but what Franklin did was he made you think that you could call him on the phone to talk about your bill. I mean, he literally made people feel that he was part of their lives and that they could bring their concerns. And it was because of her. It was because she was running a first ladydom that brought, she was a proxy. She proxied for us with him and him with us. And that no one had done that before. And they don't really do that now. They do. The first ladies have a wonderful way now of choosing an issue. Michelle Obama, nutrition, Laura Bush, literacy. That's wonderful. But, that's even too little for Eleanor. She was holistic. She wanted, she was a holistic first lady. She went the whole way and went on everything. And it's, yeah, I'm glad you brought that up.
You sound like you've really gotten involved with your character.
It sounds like you missed her.
Yeah, no, I do. And so actually it's funny thing about Zoom was I didn't understand it at first. And I'm 60, God, I guess I'm 64 now. I didn't understand this. But what happened to me in this room doing Zoom was I realized I'm in the room. This is where I wrote this book. And so I have all these feelings in here, and I have all this, like, this is me and Eleanor in here. I'm bringing, this is headquarters. And so it feels good to be here. It always feels good to be right here. The way it did when I would come out in the morning. I hated leaving here because I never got anything done, but I would love to. You never with her. She's up all night writing thank you notes. You know, I'm going to bed, for God's sakes. She's writing thank you notes. I'm coming out here in the morning, every morning, and feeling great about being here. And that's why even right now, just being here, coming with you all. And I love to be in support of the library, given people's questions and doubts about it. Let us not forget, it is really what, it's what the heart of a community is.
Thank you. Thank you. We appreciate your support. And we can't wait to see who your next project is.
Me too.
Anybody else have any questions or comments? No?
Well, Cindy, I could say to David, also, I went to Wheaton College in Massachusetts, and we invited Eleanor to come and speak to us. And so this was probably 61, I would guess. And it was a women's college, but we were all big fans of Eleanor's at the time, myself included.
She went to Wheaton, and I believe it's on, as I recall, it's on film or some recording of that. And it was quite moving, actually, because it's very late in her life, but she got very excited that day at Wheaton. Well, I'm not remembering exactly what the topic was, but I just remember there was a lot of energy when she went there.
Yep. And then remember, there's a statue of her in New York City.
Yes, it's lovely, actually. Riverside Park, yeah.
Yep. Anyhow, just another person.
Thank you.
Thank you, Louisa. Anybody else?
Cindy, I just wanted to thank the author for spending time with us and his kind comments about libraries in general and our library in specific. I really enjoyed your presentation.
Thanks, Jay. Hope to see you around.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. Okay, this concludes our program today. Thank you for joining us on Sunday
Why don't we
afternoon.
all, Cindy, why don't we all unmute and give David a nice round of applause.
Virtually and real sound.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, David, so
Thank you.
much. We so
Thank you.
appreciate it.